This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Museums have a big job. They're tasked with tackling and contextualizing some of the toughest topics in history, sometimes in real time. This includes the current war between Hamas and Israel and the resulting humanitarian crisis in Gaza. This week and next, we're going to bring you to two museums to help us understand how they act as places of discovery, dialogue, and healing. Next Thursday, we'll spend some time at the Museum of Jewish Civilization at the University of Hartford, a teaching museum working to tell the story of Jewish civilization. And later this hour, we'll take a tour of Palestine Museum US in Woodbridge. It's the first museum in the United States centering Palestinian arts and culture with the mission of humanizing the Palestinian people. But first, here to discuss how museums are rethinking how to better engage a broader public is Dr. Macushla Robinson. She's an assistant professor in residence and director of the Contemporary Art Galleries at the University of Connecticut. Macushla, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hello, thank you for having me.
And for our listeners, what role do museums play in your community? Join the conversation. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So Macushla, I want to start by asking you a bit about your expertise and line of study. Can you tell us what intersection are you at, where curatorial arts and critical theory meet politics?
Right. I am a little bit of a strange hybrid in some ways. I have a background in museums. I'm Australian, in case you can't tell from my accent, and came up through the museum world in Australia. But I kind of took a turn at a certain point and went and did a PhD in political theory at the New School in New York. And all that time I stayed in the museum. Well, I stayed in the curating space rather than the museum space. And it was very focused on the politics of what happens in those spaces. And now I am, as you said, director of the Contemporary Art Gallery at the University of Connecticut, which is not actually the museum. It's the art gallery located within the art school and art history department. So I live in this very strange mesh between being intensely political and theoretical and also putting on 2 shows a semester and teaching students, curating and doing studio visits with graduate students. So the whole thing is kind of it's where I wanted to be, and it's also a lot.
Well, I'm smiling only because, wow, your list is so long. And, especially from our perspective, you're from the other side of the globe. And it sounds like your experience is so wide range and multifaceted, and you have degrees in various different topics. But I want to touch on too, your PhD in politics and you mentioning that this is the space that you want to be in. Can you tell us more about that and sort of where that comes in, especially now you're in a curatorial art space?
Right. I think I've always understood curating to be a profoundly political endeavor. And that's a complicated thing to say. Sometimes I feel that puts people on the back foot. And so I need to clarify that when I say politics, I'm not talking electoral politics. Right. I didn't do a PhD in, how Trump got elected, although to be honest, my PhD started the year Trump took office, and it has been quite an education. Politics means so much more than that. Politics is about how we are in relation to each other as people, about the distribution of resources. It's about power and empathy, or lack of empathy, and collectivity and community. And so a space like an art gallery or a museum, which is a profoundly social space inherently focused on having an audience coming through, is just inevitably political. I found that I always was working with artists who had strong social justice commitments, who were making political statements. But I also worked in the museum on our collections and acquisitions process, which is itself political, and the back end is all about money and taxation and donors and that kind of politics. And I think I just felt ill-equipped to deal with what all of that really means. So I went to study politics rather than art history because I felt I could do more with that knowledge once I understood more about what was actually happening there.
Well, I can imagine with that knowledge too, going into art, it's so helpful to contextualize a lot of the history and the stories behind each art piece that you encounter with, and with your students too. Can you talk about the range of applications they consider when it comes to curatorial arts, especially with someone of your background, with all of your various experiences? I'm also assuming that there are a lot of applications they can use this for.
Yeah, I think that students typically study curatorial studies imagining that they're going to go into a really refined museum space and that it's all very glamorous and the curator stands back and points elegantly across the room at where the piece should go. And that's not actually what curating is most of the time for most people. It's an intensely diverse discipline and practice. I like to tell everyone how, I've taken chewing gum out of the mouth of a dancer and swapped shoes with people on the floor when they couldn't leave the floor during a Tina Segal piece. Like you do a lot of different things in curating. One of the blessings of it as a discipline is that your job is to engage with new stories with every show. So the sort of monolithic quality of disciplines can fall away when you move from artist to artist and project to project. Curating asks a lot of people that I think can be surprising. I also think I kind of just lost track of your question. Can we circle back?
No, I want to ask, what are the surprises for curating? Because I think with a lot of subjects, when students go in, I certainly had a certain idea of what communications could be, but it's a lot bigger and wider than I thought. So, what are some of the surprises that students or people in general tend to have with curating?
I mean, with me, students are constantly just surprised at how political it is. They're always like, oh my God, really? I think the surprises come in the fact that it is political in that broad sense of interpersonal connections. The politics that is imbued in curating is not just in artists making work that is political, it's in the stories that we choose to tell and how we tell those stories, where they get placed within the museum or within the art gallery. The way that you put things into a room together creates dynamics and power and sort of engages the viewer in different ways. So a lot of the time I try to talk positively about the things that we can do, but I don't shy away from talking about the things that can go wrong and the ways in which certain stories that we're just so used to telling and don't question resurface constantly and get reinscribed in the museum space or the gallery space. I think students are often surprised at how much physical labor and hustling it involves, and what it means to work with an artist. I think the thing is always, a part of the trouble is always that, like, if you're working with contemporary artists, it's always in really personal experience. And artists are their whole selves in those spaces. And you often have to field and carry a lot of emotional labor that doesn't necessarily get talked about from a theoretical perspective in the realm of curating.
Well, and just with your description, I am just thinking, wow, it's not just physical labor, but also emotional labor as well. And as you said, that's not much talked about compared to other topics. And I really appreciate your definition of politics that's very diverse, as well as curating. I think it's a lot broader than we think. And thinking about the ways museums are political, can you give us a sense of the broad range of roles that museums can perform? And also, what are some of these entrenched traditions being called into question? Because they aren't always spaces of healing, museums.
Yeah, I think that we always have to remember that the museum has a strong relationship to the state. I'm extra aware of that because when I worked in museums, they were state-funded institutions in Australia. Here, they're much more private affairs. But the reality of the museum as an evolution is that it's deeply bound up with this idea of the state and creating a national identity. So Benedict Anderson is someone that I like to bring up in this space. He wrote Imagined Communities, which talks about the kind of formation of a shared identity with people that you don't know and don't necessarily have a lot in common with through the introduction of the newspaper and newsprint being kind of creating a national identity. But he also talks about museums as conductors of national identity. When you understand that about the museum is when you start to realize how everything that happens within that space and whose story gets told and how is bound up with a very particular kind of politics, because it's about belonging and unbelonging. The state can be a place of acceptance and pride and many things, but it also can be an entity that wages war and an entity that has all kinds of economic and labor investments. And it's a really complex space when you think about the museum as being tied to the representation of the state, or to an identity that is necessarily a particular kind of political position. I think that understanding the museum as the place of healing is really, really important. The word curate comes from, or is tied etymologically to the word care. And there is this sort of religious overtone. It's connected to the care of souls. And I think that that's so important to remember, that there's care that's not just for the objects that are in your care, but also for the people who are encountering the objects. There's care for the artist when you're a contemporary art curator in particular. There's a lot of care that goes into engaging with artists. But care, I think, is a complex question as well, and it can also be tied to themes of control. So curators actually, they bear an enormous responsibility to be aware of you're hyper aware of the decisions that you make and what artists get put on display, and being a gatekeeper, but also being aware of how those stories get conveyed to viewers, and the fact that viewers are people walking through your space and receiving it as an authoritative encounter most of the time. Care is I'm really interested in themes of care. I don't quite know if I can articulate why, but to me, the idea that to curate is to care raises some complex questions about healing. Some ways, sorry, go on.
Oh, no, I was just gonna say, like, I love that idea, because the word care, like you said, it's very complicated, and especially with what we're talking about today, it's a very complicated conversation that I know we can go on for a long time, and I think it strikes me as when you said museums as conductors of national identity, I think that really struck me, because then you followed up with saying, well, there's this idea of, belonging and unbelonging, and, whose story gets told. And I think there's been sort of a reckoning in many museums here that I think the question is there, who gets their stories told, and this process of perhaps undoing some of those very entrenched traditions that you were just describing. And can you talk about, or have you seen, how good faith would you say these efforts have been? I know it's slow going, but it is going.
I think that the reckoning is a really interesting question. And the reckoning, one thing I think it's important to say is that a museum, whilst it appears to be a monolith from the outside, it's really not when you're on the inside. And institutions work in this way where there's a public face and then there's all of the conversations that happen behind the scenes. So I've been watching and being part of really important conversations about changes that need to be made behind the scenes in museums for decades. How that translates into an exhibition program and into the public sphere is it's often very, very glacial. It's sped up a lot in recent years. Museums have learned to pivot and to create space. One of the things that I find complex is the question of displaying an artist's work within a museum. So there's been a lot of work that's been displayed, particularly around the George Floyd murder, and the many ways in which that the experience of African-American survival has been foregrounded in mainstream museums. the question then becomes, is this a flash in the pan that is addressing something that seems topical now? And what can be done to stop it from being that? How structurally is the museum going to engage with its deeper histories? And yeah, representation is a kind of complicated thing. You have representation of the artists involved. Representation of non-white artists within museum spaces is growing, certainly. How is that representation reflected in the people who work in the space, the identity, what their pay scales are? And then larger questions too about like where the ethics of the museum live in terms of its investments. They are inevitably economic institutions. Where are they getting their money from? What are the kind of social and public policies surrounding funding? That's where the rubber hits the road for me a lot of the time, getting into the deeper structural issues that are at play. So a lot of fantastic exhibitions have happened in the last few years that I think have done really important work in clarifying what a certain experience will be like. The experience of, I think that question of getting to the experience of what it's like to live in a certain kind of body in this country or in other countries, to really be very real with the viewer so that they understand that we're talking about human beings. Art has that power, right?
Right. And then I am just so into what you just said, because it's the perfect transition to what I want to ask next too. Is we mentioned the Palestine Museum US in Connecticut and the fact that it's the first of its kind in the country. And so really based on what you were just talking about, the importance of who's curating, who's coming to see these exhibitions, can you talk about how museums have centered historically overlooked populations?
I see a lot of work going on in museums that are really trying to do excellent things with centering overlooked conversations. Sometimes I worry that it's that exhibition cycle where it comes in and it goes out. I think the Afrofuturism room at the Met Museum is a great example of a more permanent commitment to having a space, like a period room, that is also fantastical and involves a lot of contemporary works. And those works have been acquired by the museum. So there's a permanence to that. I think that the idea of creating space on display it's a first step. It's incredibly useful. And then the question becomes, how do we carry that space from outside of the museum into the world, into the politics? How do we actually bring change from that human encounter where you might see a work of art and actually understand somebody else's subjectivity, especially in political situations of political and violence. I mean, I'm thinking about the work of someone like Emily Jassia, who, she's a Palestinian artist she's made a lot of really powerful works. She made a video piece that documented her walk trying to get to and from work and the border crossings that were involved and just kind of the everydayness of living in Palestine. She also made works where she would go to places that other Palestinians couldn't go because she has an American passport and do things that they couldn't do on their behalf. So, taking flowers to somebody's mother's grave on her birthday and saying a prayer, or eating a particular food in a particular part of Jerusalem. It's that very ordinariness that the work conveys, and trying to wake people up to what is possible to be taken away from them, I think, more than anything else. It's almost like, we talk about privilege in this kind of hot button way now, where the word is so freighted with anxiety that it's hard to really talk about what it means. But most of the time, what it means is freedoms and abilities that you just they're so built into your life that you don't even think about what it would mean not to have them. You don't imagine that. And the role of centering the voices of artists from oppressed communities of various kinds, whether it's talking about George Floyd's murder, whether it's looking at Palestine, or it's talking to artists who've experienced disability, it's about shocking the viewer almost into realizing that there's so much that you can take for granted in life. And that's where empathy can be built into that space where you realize, I didn't even think about what it would mean that I might not be able to visit my mother's grave because of a political border and a border crossing.
Well, and I think there's something really powerful with your explanation of sort of the juxtaposition between the everydayness and also the shock of not being able to do something like that. And after a break, we're going to hear from the founder of the Palestine Museum US, Saleh, who talked about sort of the humanizing ways that art can do. And he also says that art speaks to the heart, politics speak to the mind. So I want to ask Macushla, what are your thoughts about the head and the heart's aspect of art's power, especially based on what we've been talking about?
I mean, I'm a huge fan of the phrase both and or two things can be true at once. I do think of politics speaking to the mind is certainly how we experience it, but politics is actually of the heart for me. Our hearts are political spaces where they lie, who you can love, what you can be passionate about. These things are all kind of actually enmeshed if you think about politics in a broader sense. So that's why I imagine art as a profoundly political space. I think of that emotional encounter within the space as something that has the power to change politics. I've been tracking politics in America for the last 7 years. Has shown me that it doesn't have a lot to do with thinking. That's for sure.
Right.
It has a lot to do with feeling. Feeling for a moment, even just a moment, what it's like to be in somebody else's position in the world. It's a cliche we need to walk a mile in someone else's shoes, but it's a cliche for a reason. We need to understand the differences in people's encounters and ways of moving through the world. And it's not a fairy tale of empathy that you'll understand that and suddenly you'll just, peace will just appear and everyone will just accept everyone. That's not how human beings work. But it is an opportunity to break down some of the assumptions that we carry into situations like what's happening in Israel-Palestine, like knowing at a very everyday small level just how profoundly that politics shapes people's lives. You have to have your heart open to that. You have to. There's no way that we can shift how we feel about people and how we feel about the systems that we are working within, complicit in, without having room for the heart as an encounter with those really small moments that just make life what life is. I mean, it's an accumulation of those moments. You get to the end of your life and it's going to have been all of these small everyday things. Art and poetry can do that. Art and poetry can take you into that space. Whether they can get you back out into finding political solutions that are necessary to actually support and sustain better lives for people is a different and more difficult question, but there's hope in there. They're part of that story.
Well, we're glad to hear that there's hope and as you sort of continue to be in that space with your students. So we only have a couple minutes left here, but I want to ask, because you cover the relationship between Israel and Palestine with your students each year, can you touch on how that fits in your classes and how that might have changed this fall, and why is it important to cover this in the context of curatorial arts?
I sneak a lot of colonial history into everything that I do. And I teach Israel-Palestine. I also always teach partition of India, Pakistan, colonization of the Americas. I really try to work with contemporary artists who reflect on these histories because I want students to understand that this history keeps crashing into the present. Like it's not past. The past which is not past, to quote Saidiya Hartman, like it's these afterlives, whether it's of slavery or indigenous genocide in the Americas, they live now. We're living in the afterlife of the Holocaust. We're watching immense trauma unfold and articulate into the creation of more immense trauma. We're in the midst of histories that continue to live from a long time ago. So I usually teach with things like forensic architecture, and A.L. Weissman, who is a theorist at Goldsmiths, but who runs this forensic architecture group. And they do a lot of really, in some ways, very direct political work. They do a lot of data visualization, but they use their skills as people coming out of an architecture space of visual and spatial analysis. They use those to really engage in a very powerful way with the politics that are at play. So forensic architecture were in a Whitney Biennial a few years back, and they had a very real impact on what was happening because they targeted the chairman of the board, and they did an actual an investigation into where the chairman of the board's money was coming from in terms of arms sales, and they showed that in the exhibition space. Incredibly bold, incredibly sticking to your guns. And it brought about a whole conversation that did lead to change. That change is, I like this, my favorite phrase, necessary but not sufficient. It's part of this story of everything that you learn in art school actually can have applications in all kinds of directions. I'm sure A.L. Weissman didn't set up to be the person who was going to do video investigations of war crimes, but his skills and understanding of the world through the built environment led him to that place. I think that I will say that the difference this year in teaching this has been profound. When I was teaching it first to my undergrads, it was just a few days before October 7th. And the conversation was rich and interesting, and the students were deeply engaged in knowing more about this history. And then I taught it at a graduate level last week, a different set of artists, and Emily Jassia being one of them. And whilst I think it's strange, I think everybody knows that this is very real and that this matters. I think we're also all feeling very tender and fragile and overwhelmed. There were a lot of long silences when I taught it last week, which is not normally the case. I don't normally let people sit quietly.
Right. Well, I think in this case, the silence it means a lot deeper, right, than usual. And I have 20 seconds here for you, but you're just talking about the silence and sort of perhaps the healing. Can you talk about whether or not museums can act as places of discovery, dialogue, and healing?
Of course, yes, they can, absolutely. And I think that the thing is that healing is not a one moment thing. It's not one exhibition. It's not one audience member having that encounter. Healing is a sustained and complicated and long process. We will be healing for the rest of our lives, and our children's children will be healing. Healing has to be a cultural practice. I believe strongly in the museum as a place that can cultivate that, but it takes a level of commitment that is beyond, let's tick this box, let's do this exhibition, let's acquire that artwork. It takes a fundamental rethinking of how we want to be with each other in the world.
Well, we appreciate you committing this conversation with us. That's for sure. You've been listening to UConn's Dr. Macushla Robinson. Thank you so much for being with us this morning. And coming up next, we're going to take a tour of the Palestine Museum US. For our listeners, join the conversation. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. This hour, we're looking at how museums can act as places of discovery, dialogue, and healing. For a long time, these spaces have showcased history and culture. But today, they're taking things a step further, engaging with critical, often complex issues important to the communities they serve. Where We Live, Palestine Museum US is doing just that. In April 2018, it became the very first museum in the Americas dedicated to Palestinian art and culture. It's located in Woodbridge, Connecticut on the Litchfield Turnpike. My colleague Meg Dalton recently spent an afternoon at the museum with its founder and executive director, Faisal Saleh.
On the outside, Palestine Museum US looks like any other nondescript office building. But once inside, it's a whole different story. There are a series of galleries, 6,500 square feet total, filled with all kinds of artwork. Photographs, paintings, colorful embroidery, sculptures, and more.
As a museum, we're different than any of the other museums. So the other museums usually have different departments or different sections. Like this will be sometimes chronologically, this is like the Middle Ages, this is whatever. And we're different because we're catering to a different audience and we're taking care of different group of artists. And we're trying to create a presence for Palestine where there was none before.
Faisal Saleh is the museum's founder and executive director.
Our mission is to tell the Palestinian story through the arts, basically. So we're trying as much as we can to use art as a medium to communicate to people because we want people to come here and see the work of the Palestinians and to see that we are human and we need to be treated like humans.
About 2,000 to 3,000 people visit the museum annually. But there's been an uptick in interest in recent weeks, since the October 7th Hamas attack on Israel and Israel's subsequent bombardment of Gaza.
People hear about Gaza, they want to know more. A lot of people came to the museum to show their support and sympathy. I get a lot of calls from people and email, and they says, we're sorry about what's going on, and I hope you're okay, and you have relatives there and stuff, and or do you have friends? And like some of my tenants in the building here, we have a couple of tenants, they also, stopped me and, they expressed their concern and their sympathy and things like that.
Over the past few weeks, the museum has been hosting in-person and virtual events to foster dialogue and raise awareness about the current conflict and history behind it. For Faisal and most Palestinians, what's happening right now didn't start a few weeks ago. It started 75 years ago, during what's known as the Nakba, or catastrophe in Arabic, when an estimated 750,000 Palestinians were forced from their homes after the creation of Israel. Faisal walks toward a table full of art prints and points to one reminiscent of Vermeer's Girl with a Pearl Earring.
The only difference is it's not a pearl earring, it's a key earring. And the key is a Palestinian symbol. It's the symbol of return. It's the symbol of the right of return. When Palestinians were driven out of their homes in 1948, they were told this is going to be temporary, just go out for like a couple of weeks or a month or so, and then the politicians were going to fix the problem, everybody will go back. So they locked up their houses and took the keys with them. And it's been over 75 years now, and none of them were allowed to go back. And some of them still have the keys, believe it or not, that they locked their houses with 75 years ago. So the key has become a symbol of the right of return, or people are clinging to their right to return to their homes where they were driven from.
Today, there are almost 6 million Palestinian refugees, according to the UN. Faisal says that context and history are important, and it's something the museum spotlights through its art. He shows me a wall of historic black and white photographs, taken between 1900 and 1948.
What these photos do is they confirm that there were Palestinians living in Palestine, that it was a vibrant society. They had, their own, that was a women's association that would meet once a month. There was graduation of different schools, some artisans, some commerce, political leaders.
The Nakba remains a collective trauma for Palestinians like Faisal. This history is deeply personal.
Well, I was in the West Bank. I grew up in the West Bank. I was born in a town called El Bira, which is a twin city with Ramallah. They're next to each other. My family was expelled from our village, which is near Jaffa. That's 5 kilometers east of Jaffa. And in 1948, they came to that area in the West Bank, and I was born 3 years later in 1951. And my parents had 10 children at the time, and they were all living in one room. So there were like 13 people in one room that they rented. My father didn't want us to live in a refugee camp because the conditions were really very poor. So we grew up there, and it was really a difficult life. We had to pull ourselves from our bootstraps, like they say in English.
In 1969, Faisal came to the U.S. to attend a Quaker high school in Pennsylvania. He then studied at Oberlin College and got his MBA from UConn. He spent decades in business before retiring to focus on the museum full-time. While he has no formal art background, he's been a photographer since he was 10 years old.
I like photography because, a photo is a unique instant in time and space that would only happen once, and it cannot be duplicated. And that just is a very sobering idea. And it's something that you can think about for a long time. If you don't take that shot, you missed it.
Faisal Saleh is the founder and executive director of Palestine Museum US in Woodbridge, Connecticut. I'm Meg Dalton. More from our recent visit to the museum after a short break. How do you think museums act as places of discovery, dialogue, and healing? Let us know on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Meg Dalton. This hour, we're looking at how museums are engaging with critical, often complex issues important to the communities they serve. I recently spent an afternoon at Palestine Museum US with its founder and executive director, Faisal Saleh. Based in Woodbridge, Palestine Museum US became the very first museum in the Americas dedicated to Palestinian art and culture in 2018. The museum's website says very clearly it will espouse a non-religious and non-political posture. But it's almost impossible to wade into the historical conflict at this moment without getting political.
We are not a political organization where we have a platform and lobby and do things and that. And what we're here is to preserve culture and to promote art and celebrate art and maintain Palestinian identity and tell the story of the Palestinians. That's what our role is, and that is not political. Yes, it may have some political tones to it, and you cannot totally be isolated from political things because the artists are going to paint and do whatever comes to their mind, and sometimes that looks political, sometimes it doesn't. I mean, look at the artwork here. There's hardly any of it that says politics. Right? I mean, if you see this somewhere, you'll be hard-pressed to know that this is done by a Palestinian, right?
Some of the art speaks directly to the historic and ongoing conflicts between Palestine and Israel. Faisal shows me a mural of American activist Rachel Corrie. In 2003, Corrie was killed by an Israeli bulldozer. She had been non-violently protesting the demolition of a Palestinian family's home in Gaza. Israel maintains her death was an accident. Nearby, a bridge made from keffiyehs fills the room. A keffiyeh is a black and white traditional Palestinian scarf.
This particular thing here is an art installation made of 47 keffiyehs knotted together. It's supposed to symbolize the unity, the Palestinian unity, where you have 47 different groups of political, military, whatever, but yet they can be tied together and form one thing, which is a bridge here. Now, the artist is a young, recent graduate from Columbia. with an art major. He called this neither here nor there or anywhere. We call it the keffiyeh bridge. Makes more sense to us.
And what's the importance of the keffiyeh?
The keffiyeh is a traditional headdress that Palestinians wore traditionally going back 100 years. And it comes in different colors, but the black and white was what a lot of the Palestinians wore. In the summer, many people wore just a plain white keffiyeh made out of very, very thin fabric because it's hot in the summer there. And the white keffiyeh reflects the heat, so it keeps you cool when you wear it. But it has become a symbol of another Palestinian symbol,
Faisal guides me to yet another room. There are walls of drawings made by children. Most of them are done in crayon, some in pen or watercolor. The museum has about 200 of these drawings total, with a few dozen on display. Can you describe one of these for me? You can pick whichever one you would like.
All right, so a lot of them have similar things. So you see Israeli tanks. You see people raising their hands. You see children crying. You see toys on the ground. You see trees crying. You see Palestinian fighters launching missiles. And you see trees and buildings on fire. You see planes dropping bombs or whatever. You see, Israeli gunships, Cobra helicopters, basically, not Cobra, Apache helicopters, shooting missiles down and firing, at people. Trees knocked down. You see Israeli bulldozers bulldozing things in their way, tanks shooting, the mosque being hit and burning buildings, people dead on the ground, people resisting. There's some people firing anti-tank missiles on the tanks.
Do you know the ages of kids?
Yeah. A lot of them have the info on the back. So, let me see. This one does not seem to have the age. This is pen and crayon, it said, and the size. Let me see. But they usually run from 6 to 16 in the age.
About half of the 2.3 million people living in the Strip are below age 18, according to the UN. Most Gazan children have lived through multiple wars. Faisal says these drawings were done in 2008, following an Israeli assault on Gaza. Israel was responding to rocket fire from Gaza. That led to a ground war against Hamas, and ultimately 1,200 Palestinians and 13 Israelis were killed.
And a lot of the children at the time, all of them almost, were traumatized. They say in many places, they call it PTSD. But in Gaza, they omit the P because it's constant. It's not post because there's no time to have a post. So part of therapy for the children, that some NGO asked children to, in a group, to paint what they saw, and they collected 200 of these paintings. We have all of them. We're showing 50, and the children had all kinds of stuff. I mean, the children in Gaza are no ordinary children. They're the people that have been de-childed. The term de-childing is a new term. It's where you have people who are 4 years old that experience life like a 20-year-old, and they can do things and talk things that you would never imagine what they're saying.
Other artworks in the museum are more subtle and speak to the broader human experience, including some post-impressionist and abstract paintings.
Well, art speaks to the heart. Politics speak to the mind. So when somebody comes and looking at a piece of art, it's just a whole different. First of all, you don't need to translate anything because it's a universal language of the art. And people just fall in love with art. They see a piece of art, it talks to them. I don't know how to describe it, but it does something for them.
Faisal says the local community has welcomed the museum. Once in a while, he gets a letter from someone saying Palestine doesn't exist. But the response has been mostly positive, including from some in the Jewish community. Since the museum opened, it's partnered with 2 Jewish organizations in Connecticut, the New Haven chapter of Jewish Voice for Peace and Mending Minyan.
We have cordial relations with members of the Jewish community. In fact, we have one Jewish group that uses the museum for their Rosh Hashanah religious celebration and the Yom Kippur event. We've had like 60, 70 people each time. And that shows that we Palestinians have no issue with Judaism. Our issue is not with the Jewish faith. We have respect for the Jewish faith like we respect the Christian and Muslim faith.
Faisal estimates that 40% of museum visitors are Palestinian. The other 60% are not.
We have 2 audiences, the Palestinians and the non-Palestinians. For the Palestinians, it's a question of identity. It's a question of educating the young generation about Palestine because they heard their parents and grandparents telling them these stories. Now they can come and see some of it. And it kind of closes the circle for them. And it's just when you are on the receiving end of all kinds of things that are all negative and things, it's very heartwarming to come in a place where all that is not there.
The museum may be based in Connecticut, but its reach is global. At a recent open house, 100 people attended in person and another 200 people were on Zoom. The museum's Instagram account now has close to 40,000 followers. In the future, Faisal hopes to create branches of the museum in major cities across the U.S. Faisal thinks museums like his can be places to spotlight artists whose works and voices have been historically overlooked. He hopes everyone who visits leaves a different person.
They need to be places where people that don't have a voice can go and let people hear them.
That was Faisal Saleh, the founder of Palestine Museum US. To learn more about the museum, visit palestinemuseum.us. I'm Meg Dalton. Today's show, produced by Katie Pellico and Katie Tolarski. Our technical producer is Kat Pastor. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. Thank you so much for listening.